people's thoughts are a really good starting point of intervention, right? Thoughts are not facts. Thoughts are a function of how we see the world. And when you really start to dive in and evaluate them, they all have a lot of assumptions in them, good or bad.
Welcome to Essential Coaching Conversations with Kyle and Aseem.
The real, relevant, necessary conversations to help you navigate coaching, teaching, learning, and life.
Coaches, welcome in. We have a very, very special treat, and you can see by the title of the episode and also the fact that this is not one of our new 20-minute episodes. We're going to get right into the weeds. We're going to get right into depth. Want to introduce a tremendous human being, somebody that I had the pleasure of being able to hire and work with, and to this day, I count as one of my best friends in life. Amy Peters, Dr. Amy Peters, was my former assistant, or we were on the same staff at Worcester Academy, is one of the best up-and-coming basketball coaches I've ever met, but also has a unique story and somebody who works in clinical psychology, and just an excellent, excellent human being. And we invited her on the pod today to try to shed some light on what she has seen in her basketball coaching career and also through the clinical lens, and to try to help coaches out there get some footing around mental health, around sports psychology, things like that. But as she will tell you, she is not a sports psychologist. She is a basketball coach who happens to also be a psychologist. I am not going to give a canned bio or anything like that. We're just going to throw it to Amy. Amy, introduce yourself and let the good people know who you are.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. As I was mentioning in the pre-show, it's really fun to be here as a participant, having in my my nascent coaching career, having learned a lot and consumed a lot of all the awesome work that you guys do. So I am honored to play a small piece in giving back to that. So yeah, I mean, I guess, by way of some background, like I said, I recently got into coaching, and my path to that, not necessarily that there's a normal path to coaching, but I think is probably a bit more circuitous than many or most. So I guess going way back, I mean, I grew up as an athlete. I, as a kid, kind of took the path of, had parents who, they're both math professors. There's a lot of academics in my family, so it wasn't like a crazy sports household. But my dad's a big basketball fan. And grew up in Storrs, Connecticut, which is home of UConn basketball. So there's at least a prerequisite to be a basketball fan if you grow up where I do. But as a kid, played a lot of different sports, was involved in a lot of different activities, basketball, soccer, softball, music, a little bit of theater in there. And then kind of naturally out of my own interests, I started to specialize more like late middle school and certainly by high school on playing basketball exclusively. And it was a great experience and a lot of fun, but it took up a lot of time. And this is something, we'll probably dive into a little bit more later on. But I kind of got to a stage in approaching college. I, considered a few opportunities to potentially play at the college level, but was also feeling just kind of like tired, burnt out a little bit, perhaps, and seeking some other things that I thought were important for my college experience in terms of education and where I wanted to go to, being in a big city and just having some time to be, I don't know, young adult, I guess. I was going to say kid, but, just enjoy that social experience. And so for me, athletically, the ball stopped bouncing in college, and that's where the psychology roots and career began. I went to Boston College and was a clinical psychology major there. Did a couple years of clinical research work before going to graduate school out in Chicago. I went to the University of Illinois at Chicago and got my doctoral degree there in clinical psychology. Did a year of a clinical residency out in Chicago, then came back to Boston and did 2 years of postdoctoral training at Mass General Hospital and Harvard Medical School, where I am now. So that allowed me to become eligible to be a licensed clinician in Massachusetts. And so I'm a staff psychologist at MGH and an assistant professor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry there. So my expertise and my background, as Aseem kind of mentioned, is in the mental health space, and specifically assessment and treatment of individuals who have mood and anxiety disorders. So depression and anxiety, which are the two most common mental health issues that tend to come up. I am not a sports psychologist. That being said, after I did all of that school, I finally had the time to kind of pick up sports and make that part of my life again. And I started playing a lot more in my late 20s and early 30s when I just had the time again to do stuff for recreation. And I started meeting when I was playing a lot of kids that at different parks and YMCA's, and I don't know about you guys, but whenever I see kids, no offense to Steph Curry, despite being a Celtics fan, I love Steph. When you see all the 8-year-olds who are practicing their multiple dribble combo step back moves at the park, I sort of couldn't help but resist myself from, approaching them and starting to work, working on some skills and more fundamental footwork and shooting stuff. And so I started meeting all these kids that, I developed not just training, but mentorship relationships with. I think a lot of them, although they enjoyed, the basketball piece of working together when they could, a lot of them were also just wanting to talk and seek advice about, especially, I live in Boston and intersecting with a lot of urban inner city youth were really looking for guidance on just what's going on with them and their path and interests in life and how to navigate that. And so I started finding that almost as much as I love playing basketball and the community of friends that I've created around it, that was really the light bulb that went off to get me involved in coaching, because I was like, hey, this is more fun and gratifying than me playing myself. And so that sort of brought me to the more present era of, I decided to apply for a coaching job, which connected me to Aseem and got me started in the more formal path of coaching high school basketball. So was working with Aseem at Worcester Academy last year, and this year I'm the associate head coach at Buckingham Brown and Nichols in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So
Crushing the game.
Trying,
An absolute rocket to the moon of a career in coaching, from assistant to associate head coach in a year.
I'm intrigued by this Harvard place. I'm gonna have to look it up. I'll Google it and see what all that's about. But that's somewhat impressive to be able to speak those words, and that's where you hang out, is at Harvard. So that's pretty cool.
Mass General is my primary home, but they're attached. So they claim each other. So.
I don't think they'd let me in the parking lot over there. So. But yeah, Amy, thanks for hopping on. And like I said, it's first chance I've gotten a chance to formally meet you. I know we've been able to text a little bit, and I've heard so many things about you through Aseem and y'all's time at Worcester, and kind of continuing to keep up with your career. And, obviously we get a lot of questions and talk a lot about this stuff. And as you're talking about, bumping into these kids at parks and gyms, and sometimes they just want somebody to talk to, right? They don't necessarily want another trainer or another piece of advice that has to do with their basketball game. Sometimes they just want to talk about life and what's next. And, you mentioned the ball stopped bouncing in college and you've got to kind of figure it out. And we had a friend of mine on, I think it was episode 33 in season 2, Wyatt Olson, who's getting his doctorate right now and talking about what's next. That's his identity questions of what do you do when you graduate, you have to become an adult. And not even for him so much in the sports world, but that's where something I notice working in collegiate athletics now, like coaching and teaching high school for so many years. Kids graduate, they go off to college, they have to figure out what they want to do. And then you think like, oh, okay, they're set up for success. They'll figure it out. Well, now I work exclusively with college athletes, and they don't have it figured out. And they're sitting here going, okay, I'm going to try to get through this college experience as best I possibly can. And then I'll graduate, and then I'll have it figured out. And being able to bump into some of these athletes that have graduated, and some are still playing pro, which is great, but they also know that they're not going to play pro until they're 55, right? So they've got to be able to move on. And so if it's okay with you, like I kind of want to start with this identity area. And you mentioned something about kind of this over involvement of identity. And I think, you know, with athletes, when you ask a kid, like, what do you do? Like, oh, I'm a basketball player. I'm a football player. I'm an athlete. And at some point, like that may always be a part of you, but it's not who you are in totality. And you've got to kind of grow up and evolve and be able to move past that. And I think I've struggled with that from the coaching perspective. Like I'm Coach K, I'm Coach Cav. Like I've always been Coach K. And then I get out of coaching and I'm just teaching. And let me tell you what, that was tough. Like it was a bit depressing just to think of like, oh, I'm Mr. Kavanaugh. Like, ugh. Like, no, please don't do that. And now what's worse, I'm Mr. Kyle, like to my student workers. And it's like, so I'm getting further and further away from who I always thought I was going to be for my entire life. And that was Coach K, Coach Cav. And so I deal with that at 39 years old, getting ready to turn 40. And so it's, you know, and so I imagine, try to imagine how much more difficult that could be for an 18-year-old or a 22-year-old or a 26-year-old who's having to transition out of that. So if you could just kind of dive into a little bit about, you know, that and some of the notes that we had shared before we hopped on today.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, I think the developmental difference is like really important there, right? Because you're saying for yourself and your experience, like as an adult who's had all these like accumulated life experiences and opportunity to try things in different areas and see yourself through different lenses, and yet you still feel that sense of like, oh, this really important piece of being a coach, like it's a big part of, defining who I am. And so, I think that when we talk about balance and creating kind of balanced, stable identities, it's really important for kids to have the opportunity to expose themselves and have time for lots of different areas in their life, right? So, I know you guys have spoken a lot before on like the importance of being a multi-sport athlete. And there's a lot of discussion about that, in just public spaces right now. And, I think that, there's components to that undoubtedly that are physical, right? Just the physical benefits of like playing multiple sports and injury prevention and using different muscles and acquiring different physical skills that translate, like soccer players becoming really great basketball defenders that, translate across courts and across fields. But I think perhaps lesser appreciated or talked part of it is the opportunity to have different experiences and figure out, what kids gravitate towards. So not just multi-sports themselves, but like multi-activities, right? Being able to, try other things for recreation, to have opportunities for things that are intellectually stimulating to them, beyond just, sports taking up 90% of their recreational time, to be able to have time to spend with friends outside of their athletic experience. I mean, certainly, having close teammates and the team bonding experience is a really, can be a really gratifying and important part of development, but, having adequate time for social and family relationships is really important. And I think there was this exercise that I actually did once, Kyle, I don't know if you've encountered this before from your organizational psych background, but that I actually did as part of like a career balance workshop, where we were given a wheel of kind of all these different areas, right? Recreation, physical health, your emotional functioning, your social relationships. In this case, because it was career oriented, and for a professional workshop, it was for, your career. But for kids and their development, you could think of, that would be that replaced by, school or their education. Spirituality and having opportunities for intellectual stimulation. If you think about each of these things as like a different slice of a pie, and we were asked to rate, what our overall satisfaction was in each of those different areas. And then to also assess like how big each slices of those pie are. And so I think a lot of times, like for adults, a common example would be if you, say work a lot and you're struggling in your satisfaction, or the stress at work is really high, say, you rate your satisfaction there at like a 3 out of 10 or something. If that slice of pie is really disproportionate relative to all of those other areas, the impact that's going to have on your mental space, on your overall like well-being and functioning, is going to be disproportionate. It's going to be harder to cope with that. Whereas if, you might not be really thrilled at where you are in your job or career, but say it's, a job that gives you a lot of flexibility and time to, be able to exercise, be able to spend time with your family and friends, and perhaps, engage in a side business that's really important to you, then the impact of that on your, that job on your identity is less. And so, I think we can use a similar line of reasoning and thinking with kids, that if, we, especially with kind of the direction that youth sports has gone in terms of the time and travel expectations for, some of the sports that they participate in, that, even if it's something that they gravitate towards initially, if it represents, if their sport experience represents a disproportionate amount of their time relative to some of these other experiences, and especially during a time where like they don't know who they are yet, right? Like their identities are fragile and very malleable. And so if their environmental experience is like just being completely consumed by what's going on in their sport, that when things do go up and down, and when there are stressors and, things that don't go their way, they don't have as many positive experiences to sort of balance in other areas of their life to sort of balance that out and help them have perspective on it. And so, if you identify as a basketball player or a soccer player as, an 11-year-old, and you get cut from the team, or your team's having a losing season, and that's the primary way in which you are thinking about who you are at that period of time in your life, understand it. Like it makes sense that it's going to be a lot more distressing and a lot more overwhelming and a lot more exhausting. But if kids are supported to, sure, okay, tough loss, but we're doing other fun things this weekend, and you've got a science project to work on, and we're gonna take you to your theater class, and some other things that they can do to have other positive experiences, and also to kind of distract them from the negative emotionality of whatever stressors they are experiencing in their sporting environment. So I think that just, when those pieces of the pie get to be too big, that's a balance, right? Because you also want to it's a constant struggle between how much do you kind of push, hard work, discipline, really, the value of process and trying to, really excel at your craft, versus also having some perspective and balance in other areas that make you remember there's elements of this that it is just a game and something that I want to do for fun, but it doesn't have to define me and who I am.
So you said something that I think is really interesting, right? The part about it being their craft. And you and I have had a number of discussions about kids who will walk in and say oh, but you're not letting me play my game. And they already have this well-developed idea of who they are as a player, who they've been told they are as a player. And you talked about, if you get cut from that team at 11, let's go on the opposite side of that. Let's say you've made every single team you've ever tried out for, and you've been told so many times how good you are, and like there has never been this sort of negative feedback or like non building you up or quote positive feedback to you. And then all of a sudden, like you're told as a player, hey, you're not as good as you think you are. And like that is this emotional, mental, psychological blow that seems to be something that, from a resilience standpoint, from a questioning standpoint, and from a like, wait a minute, I've never ever have heard this feedback before. Why do I feel this way right now? I think that's really hard for a lot of kids to get through. And then their parents see their kids suffering, quote unquote, suffering. And they're like, oh my God, I have to jump into like mama bear or papa bear mode. And it's like, well, wait a minute, hold on. Like, where was the feedback loop to begin with that created some of the humility that the kid needs, right? As they're growing up, they're going to fail. And then the other part is like, I don't think there's any kids out there, maybe there's like 0.01 of 1%, that can truly say that they are a craftsperson of their sport, right? So how do we reconcile the balance piece of, yes, work on your craft, yes, there's always some way to improve, and then also communicating that to the adults in a way that adults should be able to understand?
Yeah, I mean, I think the work on your craft piece is it's something that has to be intrinsic, right? Like you can't, if a kid doesn't like inherently really love the process and be really, interested in themselves, so watch different YouTube videos and figure out, how to do, learn a foot replacement to get into their shot and these things. It's hard to put that on somebody if it's not their inherent drive. And so I think that does tie back to why having all these different slices of the pie are so important, and not, putting expectations really early on, and supporting this earlier specialization when kids are still trying to figure out what that is. Because ultimately they're going to have the most success and probably the most resilience in the things that they really feel like being true learners about, and not just performers, right? Not just I do this because I'm good at it or because I've had some success, but because I really like, am curious to learn, I'm curious to push my boundaries. And I think in order for kids to find those things, they have to have enough time and support to be able to experience a variety of different things before kind of committing, at 9, 10, 11, 12 years old of like, hey, this is it,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Kyle, you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, you said the word curious about it, like treating them as a learner versus a performer. So it's more about the exploration of play than it is to become this technical master of something. And, we've talked ad nauseum about, environmental and game design and the importance of, fundamentals over technique and all this kind of stuff. But I think you're right. Like we all want our players to take their game seriously. Like you need to work on your craft outside of practice. I mean, I've shared this story before about me getting embarrassed at, music practice in college because I wasn't prepared to walk in to rehearse that day. And I was told straight up in front of everybody that rehearsal time is not your time, it's our time. Like you come in prepared to make music with everybody, work on your craft outside of the time. And so there are definitely pieces to that. But I think you're spot on about where the motivation is coming from. It can't be because mom and dad are forcing you to go into the driveway or coach is making me do that. Like we all grew up in the driveway because we wanted to grow up in the driveway. Now we didn't have the distractions that everybody has nowadays, and so those decisions and motivations and stuff are being pulled in a ton of different directions. But coming from a classroom teacher perspective, where I became hopefully became a better teacher, was when we started to focus more on the learning versus the performance of spitting out facts and actually trying to explore our space and so on and so forth. And I love thinking about emotional intelligence kind of starting with curiosity, and Kip will say like curiosity is a superpower, because if you're curious, you'll try something, and if you try something, then inevitably you're going to have to stretch yourself. And if you stretch yourself at some point, regardless of how lucky you may be at the beginning, you're going to eventually trip and stumble and fall.
Right.
And then if you remain curious, you're going to get back up and you're going to try again, and you're going to figure things out. And so treating our players as learners first, not performers, I think is huge. And I think it's the same thing with kids in the classroom and all these different areas. But I think it comes back to using curiosity as kind of a starting point, because if kids can develop that, that will take them further in life, regardless of whatever field they decide to get into. The foot replacement, or the where the hand goes on the ball and how to block out and great running technique, all of that technical stuff can help them be successful in that craft in that particular moment. But if you start from a place of curiosity and play, they are going to learn skills that will turn them into better clinical psychologists, teachers, marketing professionals, like whatever else it is. Those are more foundational skills. But I just feel like we're getting into this old man yelling at clouds, this place in society where we want to skip all of that and we just want to get straight to the technical expertise because we feel like that's what's going to get them there. And sure, we got beat 6-0 on the soccer field, and you gave up 3 goals as the first half goalie, and you got pulled. But we're going to go to theater class now, or we're going to go watch a movie, or we're going to do this. Most people would say, well, then how am I ever going to be a Division I goalie? I can't spend my time focusing on going to the movies or music class or having another hobby. Like, I got to get right back out on the field, and I got to grind, and I got to make sure I'm not giving up, because if I'm getting pulled in 7th grade girls soccer in the first half, I'm never going to be a Division I athlete and win a gold medal in the World Cup for my country. And that's where, like, that anxiety and I think the pressure starts to build. And it's not necessarily the kid's identity, it's external forces from parents or so on and so forth, and they end up kind of taking that on, and they don't want to, and B, they don't know how to process all of that.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I think it becomes like, I mean, you said the piece about, like, the struggle being an important part of learning, and inevitable part of it is that, they're going to stumble and they're going to fail. And I think that when there's more of an emphasis on performance, it doesn't allow for that to be a normative part of the process. And so when kids are trying things early and they are experimenting, but they aren't performing to, whoever's expectations, whether that's the coach, whether that's the parents, whether that's the scoreboard, whether that's the, person behind the paywall that's writing the reviews on social media of their performance. That I think on the mental side of things, helping a way that we can better support them is helping them and pairing that learning experience with the mental skills and understanding of failure is going to be a normative part of that. I was talking with a coach who actually runs one of my basketball leagues, and he said that he had a player who just looked totally dejected after she made a turnover in a game. And he pulled her and he asked her, like, what are you thinking about, after you turn the ball over? Like, what's going through your mind? And he said that her response was that she felt like a failure. And he was like, whoa, like, he couldn't even really completely process this, because he's like, I turned the ball over and I'm like, I want to get that back, and like, I want to go down the other side and, like, prove that I can show my stuff. But I think that's not all that uncommon of a response. The attrition from youth sport data by gender disparity is pretty alarming, especially for like adolescent girls. Where I think it's around like 45% of adolescent girls who previously in elementary school had been participating in some sort of sport that they, identified enjoying and initially having a good experience with, drop out. And the primary reason for most of them that they stop playing is fear of being judged by other people and struggling with their confidence. So I think if we're going to say, part of the learning process is that you have to experience this failure, but kids are saying at a pretty young age that, like, that's already having a negative impact on them, that from a psychological standpoint, from a mental skills standpoint, one of the things that we can do better at helping support them is by understanding that that is a normal part of the process and giving them tools to reframe, cognitively, emotionally, some of the thoughts that are going through their minds so that, they can take a different perspective on what the meaning of that mistake is. So that it's not, overcoming their identity of, I'm a failure, or I'm not good at this, or I'm now a bad basketball player or bad soccer player or whatever it is. So, I think it's an interesting time. I feel like we're in the athletic space right now because I feel like there's a lot of effort to promote awareness about the importance of mental health, and awareness is the first step to to anything, right? To any kind of movement of change. But I think there's like kind of a lot of talk about like, yeah, this is important. We need to support athletes in this way. But yet, that's not a systematic part of our programming to say, hey, rather than, sending you off to a psychologist once you develop a mental health problem, or, giving you specifically which some like Division I programs might have like a performance consultant specifically to, help improve and facilitate on-court performance through mental skill strategies, but that's not something that exists or is a resource at the youth level to be like, hey, we're going to make it, a standardized part of our programming to, not just train the physical, but train the mental of, how do we, when those inevitable failures or mistakes happen, what is our perspective that we take on those? What are the thoughts that are going through our mind? How do we, how do those affect the emotions that we're having in response to it? And are there places where they can be modified to be responded to in a more healthy and adaptive way? And I think particularly if this is happening, and it's a big source of dropout for kids at age 12, 13, like that's the preventative space where we need to start. It's great to have those, if the colleges have funding to have those type of resources at the more elite levels, that's wonderful. But I think that, kind of moving that back, and if, we're going to tell kids as coaches, sport is 90% mental and 10%, right? Is that Yogi Berra quote? I think.
Yeah.
It's 90% mental, 10% physical, but yet our training is kind of flipped the opposite way, that maybe we spend 10% of the time on really like breaking down those concrete mental strategies with them, and spend a lot more time just training the physical and expect that they can kind of cope and respond to the ups and downs in their performances. So.
It's sort of similar to that wheel you were talking about with, your spirituality and your work life and your home life. And like, if, it's 30% of the pie, but, you're giving it 80% of the attention, then there's this imbalance. Yeah. And so that's where it comes back to like the training piece of, hey, we're going to sit here and say that we need to be tough and resilient and gritty, and we need to have character and leadership, but we talk about it in the first team meeting and then we never touch it again. And it's all about, dribbling through 19 cones, and we're going to work on this and that. And this is the perfect box out technique. And we're going to put in 87 set plays, but yet we struggle at the end of game when things get chaotic and we don't have a timeout, and you're not training in those areas, then that's where some of that imbalance comes from. And so, half of this, every episode I guess we ever do, really we could just call this entire podcast adults telling on themselves. Like this is another instance of where we are doing that. And I think sometimes we feel like, well, the kid needs to figure out how to handle the adversity, and it's like, he's a kid. Like, we don't know how to help them handle the adversity. And so that coach, saying, hey, what's going through your mind? And 9-year-old Sally's going, I feel like a failure, like in life. And it's like, whoa, hold on. Hang on a second. It's one turnover. Like, where is that coming from? Like we could spend hours just diving into that one interaction. And so it's like, how do we as adults help other adults? How do we as coaches help other coaches? Where do we get the resources to help deal with what potentially could be, like, not being over dramatic, but like that could be a huge moment in that young athlete's career and life of like how we handle that turnover. I feel like a failure. Why? Like, where did that come from? Is it because of you or the team, or, can you bounce back, so on and so forth? Does the coach go, yeah, you're right, and pull them because you didn't do what I told you to do in practice yesterday? Like, that might be the end of that kid's playing career. It's just too much. So like, how do we kind of get around the lack of resources. Like, where can we go? And maybe you don't have a great answer for this, but like, I think that's where we sit here and try to talk about this a lot. Like, I was reading, I'm reading Social Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. So I read Emotional Intelligence like a billion years ago. I've been reading Social Intelligence recently, and he's the last chapter I read actually was on like adults and kids sort of bouncing back from some of this stuff. And there was a quote in there, I'll probably butcher it, but it was basically like, there's this misguided theory that if parents can keep their kids from avoiding failure, that's what will turn them into happy adults. If we can just, not ever have to deal with anything stressful, that's what's going to equate to a happy, well-adjusted adult. And it's like, that's not realistic. It's not going to happen in life. It's not going to happen in reality. And you are going to have to lean into the skid a little bit and learn how to deal with those things. But it's almost as if we're putting that responsibility on the kid or the athlete. Where is the responsibility from us as adults to help them navigate that? I guess is my question.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're right. Like those moments can be super impactful. And I think that, I think one of the things I've struggled with as in my background as a clinical psychologist, observing some of this stuff as a coach, one thing that I haven't mentioned is that I'm currently in the process of doing some education to become a certified mental performance consultant, who is I'm still in training for it, but that is the sort of, on-court, on-field, using psychological skills to enhance performance. But it creates these like two ends, right? Of like, you have kids who already have certifiable diagnosable mental health problems, others who, maybe there's some on-court stuff that's sort of, differences between their performance and practice and game that we want to figure out how to kind of optimize. But then there's like this big middle ground of kids who are overworked, who are overwhelmed, who are feeling exhausted, who at any moment, right, these performance failures, up and downs, other stressors within the team may really have an impact on their overall well-being and their overall kind of functioning. And so I think that's a group that kind of gets missed in the, like, we're going to send you over here to the psychologist, or, hey, we're going to, give you some mental performance service of, like, there's this larger contingent of kids. The NCAA actually during COVID started doing well-being surveys. And again, there's a pretty big gender disparity, and it's fortunately improved, not a lot, but a little bit since COVID. Obviously, that certainly was exacerbating stress and mental health issues. But that around like the mid 40% of female athletes, anyway, I think it's quite a bit lower in males, is around, I think the figure was about 17%, but that are feeling overwhelmed, feeling exhausted, feeling like they don't know how to manage all of these things. And so that's like a group that is at, I would view to be at very high risk, right, for when any of these like individual moments or triggers may have a really profound impact on like how they view themselves, what they, how they conceptualize their overall athletic experience. And so, Kyle, you're asking what do we do about it? I don't necessarily have the answer for it yet.
That's why we brought you on.
But I'm trying, which is that that I think there is a space to evaluate more preventative interventions. And instead of using interventions that are wholly in the language of mental health, of teaching, making a standardized process within athletics of having some resource to teach. And it could be, it could start with mental health professionals, but also like mental health professionals can educate a paraprofessional workforce in terms of, could consult to coaches who then could, disseminate this down to their teams afterwards of instead of starting from the viewpoint of like, you have a problem that we need to fix, or you have a failure that we need to correct, that using mental skills and strategies and improving our cognitive flexibility and being able to open our mind to different interpretations and taking different perspectives of how a certain, event or play within a game or, conflict within a team happened, of being able to identify and just come up with like positive self-talk statements. I mean, you'd be really surprised, especially for young teenage girls, just like how hard that can be for them to even say like and identify positive things about themselves. To, you know, help kids, you know, walk through and explore like what are their motivations for participating in sport, help them bring some perspective of like, you know, why am I really doing this? What do I like about it? What do I gravitate towards? You know, is it, you know, on the more intrinsic side of things, or do themes come out where like they're kind of just doing it because that's what my brothers and sisters did, or that's, you know, what my parents signed me up for. And through the lens of like, this is a normative part to help you excel in your current sporting environment and get the most out of your performance, that we expect these these ups and downs to happen. And so these are the mental strategies that we prepare you with and pair with to help you cope with that, as opposed to it kind of letting that at-risk group get to the point where they're already really struggling. They're, you know, they've maybe dropped out of their sport. They're maybe starting to feel more burnt out, even verging on, you know, the order of depression. And then that's something that they need, you know, a more intensive or different focused intervention to kind of bring them back from. So it's something that from a research standpoint in my own career, it's something I'm working with a couple colleagues to try to evaluate this kind of intervention in school settings, and you know, see if it helps with both engagement, you know, retention and prevention of attrition from sports, but then you know, also to evaluate its impact on satisfaction that kids have in their sporting environment and their overall like well-being and mental health more broadly.
So to that point, right? Something that I think all of us have encountered in our careers is this pushback of my kid doesn't need that, or stop trying to parent my kid, or any of these, you know, like parent things that they say, or on the other side of it, coaches who are unwilling or unable to align to what that mental health provider is saying to the kid. So as an example, you know, if one of our players at wherever, like, you know, Nobody You, for example, right? If they were to go see the dedicated sports psychologist and they're getting all this great feedback from them, they're trying to put things into motion, yet the coach that is responsible for their playing time, which we know is the social cloud, it is the social currency, it is how athletes are going to judge their performance of whether they're going to get to play or not. There's a lot of that unlearning that has to happen. I don't think we have time on this episode to cover all of that, but maybe that's a part two. From the adult perspective, what would you say to those who are interested in trying to make this systematic change within their purview, but also B, and perhaps more importantly, trying to help other adults see the value in a way of like sticking up for kids and saying, hey, you need to align to what these mental health providers or what these sports psychologists or even like the performance folks are saying. Like, you can't send somebody to a place to quote get fixed and then come back into a relatively abusive environment that doesn't align with the feedback that they're getting, right? So how do we kind of put all of that together?
Yeah. I mean, I think kind of the first stage of research is more qualitative, which I do think has been happening, which is encouraging, right? Like, I think to some extent, you need to show some of these parents and perhaps the coaches the data, right? If it's not there, then it's easy to say, oh, they just, you know, they need to suck that up and be more resilient and wave that off, right? But if the kids are saying in their own language that they're struggling and that they want help with these things, but they don't know who to go to and they don't feel comfortable going to the sports psychologist because, you know, it's in the general counseling office and I'm a 300-pound, you know, linebacker on the football team that is not exactly anonymous to like walk myself over there across campus. And that's what I think that there's more that can be done in that area. I do think there are some like limitations to some of the screening measures that we have right now. Like You guys have probably had the experience before of like, you walk into your PCP office and you get asked 1 or 2 questions about, have you been feeling depressed or down or anxious in the last 2 weeks? And it's like, okay, if you are feeling really depressed or down or anxious and you identify with like, that's the problem that you have, you might say yes, but also it's very easy to say no if you're not ready to get help with those things, if you're worried, if there's stigma associated with that. It's very, it's face valid and that you're going to capture people who are already identify with that, but it's not necessarily maybe like the best language, again, for this kind of like gray area middle group where it's not necessarily a mental health problem or disorder, but there's other ways in which they're struggling. And so I do think like the NCAA surveys did a pretty nice job of illustrating some of that, like that the kids are feeling tired, they're feeling overwhelmed, they, are attributing this to sources that they don't know how to balance the time of their athletic commitment with their school activities, with, having time for family, with thinking about, they're worried about their future and what they're going to do next. And so, I think hearing from the kids to that standpoint is important. And if that's what they're saying, then it's not coming from the coach.
Right.
It's not coming from the other professional, right? It's as a parent or as a, coach, it's coming from your kid or your player themselves of like, hey, I'm struggling with this. I want to do something about it. I know that there's resources for it, but I don't feel like it's fitting my needs.
Well, and so to that point about it's sort of the anecdotal data too, right? The percentages, I think a lot of adults can look at the percentages and be like, okay, well, my kids fall into 57% that don't have this issue, right? But I remember when we were at Worcester and we did our parent retreat, and you were talking about the car ride home, like you were giving your segment. I think we had you scheduled for like an hour, right, to talk to the parents about like, performance triggers and then the car ride home and some other things. And I remember all of our players were lined up at a table in the back, right? And so just to set the scene for everybody, because I think this is really important. That's the data part that I think parents and coaches don't get to see unless they invest in something that makes it come to the forefront. So we're in, this big room at the school, and there's long tables. And so the parents are sitting up near a TV, right? It's a huge TV in the front. It's like an 80-inch TV in the front of the room. And they're sitting at these long tables. There's a little bit of space. And then in the back section, there's more long tables where all of our players are sitting on the table watching you give this talk to these parents who are rapt to attention. And we had 12 kids on the team, 13 kids on the team. And every single one, as you're talking about the car ride home and the detrimental effects of feedback and how to change the feedback loops and all of this stuff, they are literally like starting to stand up and be like, yes, thank you for talking about this. Like, that is my parent, right? And like their parents are sitting right there. And I don't know if I said it before or after or something. I was like, look at your kids. Like, look how much they care about this. You are guilty of doing this, whether you believe that or not, right? Because they are internalizing the feedback that they're getting on the car ride home. And all of the parents were like, oh my God, I had no idea. And it's like, are you that not self-aware that like you're causing this internal harm for your kids? And then I don't think anybody does it on purpose, but I think that the stakes societally have become so high for excellence in sport because you can go to college for free, or like, there's an identity piece, which we started at, at the beginning talking about, but like that to me was the ultimate data point where you have 12 out of 12. That's not 43%. That is 100% of kids looking at 100% of parents being like, yes, this is a problem. You have to stop.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's this important distinction too between like mental health and mental well-being, right? And I think that's part of the struggle between these different like interested parties is like, I don't think parents mean any harm by it, right? Like they're there supporting their kid. They want to talk about the game. They want to try to figure out like how to help them get better. It's not necessarily like malintentioned. And certainly I'm sure they do not view it as like, this is going to cause a mental health problem for my kids. So like, then, the next step being like, sure, I should, send them to a psychologist to go and like talk about this. Like, and I'm not saying that would be, I don't necessarily think that that's appropriate sequence of action. But I think the parent doesn't necessarily know what the impact of that mental habit of dissecting and digesting and going over and over the game at a time, particularly right after, when the emotional association with that event is just, the kids are really emotionally primed in that moment. They're still processing, they're still activated. And to be honest, the kids are somewhat guilty of it too, right? Like, we would talk about how, we would encourage them not to think about the game or talk about the game until after a certain period of time, but we would always comment on noticing how there was this like 48 to 36 hour recovery period after every game, of them kind of riding those emotional highs and oftentimes more significant lows, where they are really dissecting the game and digesting it over and over again, and going back over, they did this, and if only she passed me the ball there, and taking a more kind of critical finger pointing lens that can happen in these car rides, either by parents or players themselves, and not having the awareness or the appreciation for, maybe that's not the most constructive, like, mental loop or habit to get into after a game, and that what would be some alternatives, how can I kind of distract myself, have a more like positive experience that I can kind of, shift my mood, shift my attention. Or if I am going to talk about it, like, how can I talk about it more constructively, right? Like, are there things even, in a bad game or a loss that I can identify as positives? Or for things that I do legitimately want to correct, like, focus on what concrete steps can be taken to correct that, as opposed to just getting in these, like, the psychological word that I use for it is, it's a form of rumination, which literally means just like, it comes from observing cows chewing grass over and over and over again. And so I think, something like that for parents and athletes alike, there's sometimes this lack of just insight and awareness into some of like those automatic like mental habits that we go into that are directed at our sport. So it's not necessarily viewed or conceptualized like this is a psychological element or a mental habit that needs correction, when in fact there's actually other ways to think about it, other ways to talk about it that could be more constructive if more light was shed on that. So
Aseem, I want to, before we kind of wrap up, I want to make one little point. You mentioned something about, I think you said athletic, but I would say athletic and academic excellence, and like the pursuit of that. And I think one of the issues or misconceptions about that is that excellence has to equal perfection, that we can't reach excellence if it's not perfect. And excellence is far from perfect. Excellence is the getting back up, the stumbling, the road to success is very windy, right? It's not a straight point. And I think a lot of times where, coaches, athletes, parents, everybody, we fall into this trap of like, well, if it wasn't perfect, if I didn't play the perfect game, I scored 22 points, I had 11 rebounds, 8 assists, but man, I had those 4 turnovers. And, Kobe would have obsessed over the 4 turnovers, because that's how you go from good to great and from great to excellent. And, that's how you become a GOAT and all this stuff. And that's where, like, yeah, okay, he was wired that way, but he also wasn't a perfect human being. And your kid isn't Kobe, first off. This is 8th grade basketball, so let's chill out a little bit. And so I think some of that is just rerouting a little bit of, or reframing, like what is success? What is excellence? What is, us achieving a particular goal, and that perfection doesn't exist. Like, we have to throw that piece out of it, because if I make 1 B in 11th grade English, I won't become a clinical psychologist at Harvard. Like, it's going to ruin my dreams, or I'm not going to get into med school, or I won't be a CPA or whatever. And so all of that pressure just continually compounds. And the more successful you are, the harder that pressure becomes. So like my buddy Mike, they won 10 games in a row, 14 games in a row, 18 games in a row. And every time you win a game, the next one, like, it puts that much more pressure on winning the next one. And same thing with a championship. We won the first one at Simsboro, double the pressure to win 2, triple the pressure to win 3, and then so on and so forth. And it's just, that's not sustainable, I don't think. Like, at some point, you can't keep up with that pace, and you're going to crack. And so as much as we hate coach speak here, and we work very diligently on our coach speak community, there is something to be said for next day, waking up and starting all over again, one day at a time, one foot in front of the other, next rep, next play. There is something to be said for that, where you might win 18 in a row, but that doesn't dictate the outcome of game number 19, right? Like, you might have had a bad game, but that doesn't necessarily have to dictate or translate into how well or poorly you play on Saturday. Like, it's a new day. And so I think being able to come back and kind of reset, reframe, and then, we mentioned in these notes here, like, a lot of interventions and strategies. And I would love, Aseem, to get Amy back on, and maybe we dive more specifically into some of those. Let's talk about cognitive flexibility. Let's talk about self-talk. Let's talk about goal setting. Let's talk about controlling the environment that you're in and some of these thinking traps that you mentioned. Like, I think it would be really valuable to come back on, and instead of us having a 30,000 foot view conversation, let's dive a little bit deeper into like what this is, and maybe give some coaches out there, teachers out there, some specific action steps, like you mentioned a little bit earlier, on like, hey, if this does arise, this is something that I could try. I think that would be great. Amy, if you're willing to come back on and hang out with us again.
Yeah, would love the excuse to, for sure. Yeah, as you were saying all that, I think that was exactly where my mind was going, of like the reframing, right? I mean, I think people's thoughts are a really good starting point of intervention, right? Thoughts are not facts. Thoughts are a function of how we see the world. And when you really start to like dive in and evaluate them, they all have a lot of assumptions in them, good or bad, right? And some of those assumptions can lead to things like perfectionism, or kind of forecasting, right? One bad game, predicting the next, and, feeling like it's sort of all or nothing, right? Really good game, but focusing on the turnovers. So then that, what was general and well balanced, then all of a sudden becomes bad or not good enough. And so, how we can help kids, start to identify what some of those are, and some of those thinking traps that they can fall into. And also understand then how that leads to their emotional responses, right? Like, we have thoughts that then dictate how we feel, dictate how we perceive our experience and how we feel about it. And then that in turn, like, affects how we're going to respond to something, and behaviors that we engage in. It becomes this like feedback loop. And so starting at that level of like how we're perceiving things and using strategies to reframe them, we absolutely could spend a whole session talking about that.
I say we make it a weekly thing. Why not? The weekly psych check-in with Dr. Amy Peters. I'm all in.
Well, you got my Bitmoji, right? So you can just keep it.
Yeah, we'll just make new cover art. Maybe we even launch like a new podcast of just that.
Offshoot.
Yeah. Well, Amy, as we wrap up here, can't thank you enough for coming on. It's always a pleasure to see you. We used to spend literally every day together, and now it's only through a screen. So it is what it is. What are you gonna do?
Always welcome the chance to chop it up with you, and glad to be able to do it with Kyle as well this time too.
Awesome. So we will put in the show notes any of the resources that Amy talked about today. If there's any of the data that anybody wants to see, it'll all be in the show notes. We look forward to part 2 with you. We don't know when that's going to happen, but we'll try to get that on the books relatively soon. And maybe it turns into literally like a weekly 20-minute, like, hey, here's your sports psych or just psych thing for the day to think about. We will post this episode and get the clips out, and hopefully, we can keep this going. But really appreciate you, Amy. Thank you for coming on.
Sounds great. It was fun.